right, good afternoon. As Brian mentioned, my name is Aman Sharma. I'm the president of the Federalist Society this year at the Moritz College of Law. Some of you missed our first meeting on last week. It was Thursday. So we'll give a short preview of what the Federalist Society is in case you're interested in joining, which I think you should do. The Federalist Society is an organization composed of mostly libertarian and conservative law students and legal scholars. We seek to educate, recruit, and mobilize both current and future lawyers for the cause of liberty and the rule of law. When you join the Federalist Society, you'll be in good company. We have over 20,000 members around the country, and we have chapters active in virtually every law school in the nation and at most of America's major cities. The chapter here at Moritz throughout the semester will be hosting a variety of speeches, debates, panel discussions, and things of the sort. And they're drawn from a wide variety of topics. Of course, our last event was on the 9th and 10th Amendments and the relationship between the federal and state governments. This one is on foreign policy. We're very pleased to have with us today two distinguished scholars. The first, Doug Bandow, is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He specializes in foreign policy and civil liberties affairs. He earned a JD from Stanford Law School. He's written for a number of periodicals and appeared on a wide range of TV networks, including Fox, MSNBC, CNN, NBC, pretty much you name it. He has worked in the Reagan administration. He was serving as a special assistant to President Reagan and a senior policy analyst in the office of then President-elect Reagan on the campaign. I'll introduce also Professor Quigley. Professor Quigley, somewhat of a fan favorite here at the law school. He's been here since 1969. He teaches international comparative law. He spent a year as a visiting professor in Tanzania before coming to Ohio State, and Professor Quigley has also served as a research scholar at Moscow State University. At Harvard Law School, he was a research associate in comparative law, and since he's active in international human rights work, he's written numerous books and articles on the topic, especially dealing with the United Nations and foreign policy affairs. In 1995, he was distinguished with the Ohio State University's Distinguished Scholar Award for his outstanding scholarly achievements. Our topic for today is, when can America lawfully go to war? The format will be as follows. Mr. Bandow will have approximately 30 minutes to speak, followed by a 15-minute commentary by Professor Quigley. After that time, there will be an optional 5-minute period for Mr. Bandow to give his thoughts, and then we'll take questions from you, the audience. So if you'll join me in welcoming Mr. Doug Bandow.
Well, thanks, Aman. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about when we can go to war. What I proposed when Aman came up with this as a topic, which is a little unusual, usually Federalist Society focuses on more domestic topics, but I suggested it's not just kind of when we can legally go to war, but when we should go to war. So I think that actually matters, and it plays very much into this debate. It's a very important issue. It's one that I take personally. My father and former brother-in-law were both career Air Force, and my nephew just joined the SEALs and has gotten through the program, so he's going to be kind of the hard edge of where the military goes in coming years. So the question is, when should people like that be sent into combat? When should we use them? And it strikes me there really are two very important questions here. One is the legal question. When can we legally go to war? And the other is, when should we go to war? Because the legal question theoretically binds us, but of course in practice it very often doesn't have a lot of impact. I mean, the reality is we may go to war whatever the law says for a number of reasons. So I think it's worth thinking about both of these as being related issues. To some degree, the view of the importance and the reluctance to go to war is going to inform our decision on our legal view in terms of when you can go to war. So I want to start with the question of, when should we go to war? And this, I think, is it helps if you're a large superpower and have the strongest military on earth. It means you can pretty much go to war whenever you want. That one doesn't have to feel quite so constrained about legal questions as others. I think in many ways, the starting question is, what is war? There's a lot of conflicts out there. Military is used quite often. What do we even consider to be war? And I think to some degree what we're looking at is not just an act of war. There are lots of acts of war. The North Koreans sank a South Korean ship. It was an act of war, but they're not currently at war, because of that. But there's a difference there. And to some degree, I think when we're thinking about war, we're thinking about a series of acts of war with political ends. We're thinking about something relatively substantial, not just one shooting incident, but something much more intense. And there, I think, Potter Stewart's old admonition about pornography, I know it when I see it. If I look at Vietnam and there are 58,000 dead Americans out of it, I think it's probably a war. Whether or not it was declared as a war or Korea may be called a police action, but it sure looks like a war when you're talking about 3 years of combat across the Korean Peninsula and tens of thousands of casualties on the American side and even greater casualties on the other side. And I think one has to ask the question then, that even if it's a one-of kind of incident, we see that very often on things, threats, for example, to attack Iran, attack North Korea, the threatened invasion of Haiti in 1994, bombing of Bosnian Serbs. These things, I think, should be viewed as war, as opposed to simply, minor military actions. They should, especially if one is going to initiate conflict, initiate this kind of action, one should view it as being a war subject to the normal constraints, both legal and practical, of going to war. If we're thinking about war, it should be viewed as more than just, not just another option. There's a lot of different tools that one can use internationally. Diplomacy, moral suasion, one can use economic aid, one can use sanctions. We've used them all. You can use international organizations, you can use, sanctions coming out of the United Nations. There are a number of tools internationally, and these have varying degrees of success, of course, and varying degrees of cost. And some of them, in fact, can be extraordinarily costly. There was a famous exchange with Madeleine Albright back when she was UN ambassador, where she was asked in one of the Sunday TV shows, well, Madam Albright, isn't this very, kind of significant? 500,000 Iraqi babies have died because of sanctions. And she said, oh, we think the price is worth it. And that's a comment that has resonated around the Muslim world and not to our favor. But and there's a good argument that, in fact, that was an inflated number, and one can blame Saddam Hussein for those deaths. Nevertheless, that shows that sanctions themselves can be as costly, or indeed potentially more costly than a war. So these tools, even kind of tools short of war, aren't necessarily costless in terms of their impact. The problem is that most of these other tools are not going to be effective if you're talking about a regime that has what it perceives as vital interest at stake. And that's normally where we're facing the issue of using force. If it's a question of regime survival, if it's a question of security, and you look at the hard cases today, will North Korea give up its nuclear weapons because of sanctions? The answer appears to be no. Is Iran likely to give up in whatever nuclear ambitions it has because of sanctions? I think the answer is likely no. We have a problem of Burma, monstrous regime, massive human rights violations, been under sanctions for many years. Doesn't seem likely to change course. The question is, what do you do then when you're dealing with regimes that are not susceptible to other forms of, kind of foreign policy tools? Should you go to war? I think at this point we have to recognize that war really is unique. There's something different about war than most of these other steps. One is the threat to life. War involves destruction and killing, and there's no other way to get around it. That's what the military is very good at. That's what we design weapons for. That's what we train people to use those weapons for. There's something unique when you move to war from other sorts of diplomatic, foreign policy, economic tools. Something very different. Very often you get unexpected consequences. Nobody would go to war if they thought they were going to lose. So anybody who starts a war is assuming they're going to win, and of course somebody always loses out of these. Very often it's the people who started it. And very often there are unintended consequences. The Bush administration did not expect when they started war in 2003 in Iraq that in 2005, 2006 they'd have a sustained guerrilla campaign going on. It was not on their minds. When the American Civil War started, one of the great comments came from former Senator Chestnut of South Carolina. He said he would drink all of the blood that would be shed as a result of secession. Well, he was wrong. It turns out there's an awful lot of blood that was shed, and he could never have drunk all of that. So you have to recognize that war is almost unique in the way that it can open up a Pandora's box of the utterly unexpected. Moreover, the destruction that is wrought by war very often carries beyond the immediate conflict, but goes well beyond. World War I essentially destroyed all of the old orders of Europe and loosed upon the modern world Nazism, communism, and fascism. These all kind of came out of the Pandora's box when it was opened. One can even look, I think, at Iraq and say the destruction of kind of the regime of Saddam Hussein, which is a very welcome thing, nevertheless loosed passions and antagonisms and conflicts that we had not expected. Completely, just not planned for and not ready for. That, and even now we're going to be paying for those costs for a very long time, the wounds coming out of that war. The good news is that, a lot more people survive today than they did during Vietnam. The bad news is they survive with much worse injuries. These costs will be with them and the rest of us for years ahead. So what you see then are war has unique consequences and uniquely destructive consequences. The question then is, when do you resort to it? The most obvious case, I think, is self-defense. Everyone would accept that. There's an important distinction, I think, between preventive war and preemptive war. Preemptive war is the notion you're about to be attacked and you take out the attacker. The classical example would be the 1967 Six-Day War with Israel. Or one could imagine if we had seen and were aware of the carrier groups approaching Pearl Harbor in 1941, we could have attacked them preemptively. Preventive war is something very different. Preventive war is trying to look ahead years or potentially decades and say, these people may be threats, let's take them out today. We had that kind of debate actually over China in the 1960s, proposals to take out their nuclear program. We decided not to do so. That's a much more kind of a different judgment than preemption, which is an immediate threat. Preventive is trying to assess threats ahead of time. I think more dangerous to take on. I think that the question becomes more complicated as whether you want to go to war for kind of defense of others, humanitarian intervention, for example, which becomes a more dubious and a more difficult moral calculus to make. Obviously, our government is primarily responsible to its own people, including those in uniform. And there are a lot of practical issues here in terms of what does humanitarian intervention stand for. We went to war in 1989 or 1999 over Kosovo at a time where far more people were dying in Liberia, for example. We seem to care far more for white Europeans in the Balkans as opposed to black Africans. The danger with these situations is they often require long-term involvement. We see that in Kosovo today, where Allied military forces are still present and there's still an argument over independence. Problems of nation building are almost inherent as part of these sorts of interventions. They become much more problematic. I think that if it's a question of other interests out there, you get arguments over economic interests, trade. We need this to protect trade routes, geopolitics, balance of power. One should be much more cautious in using war because the benefits, I think, are less while the costs remain potentially very high. In terms of terrorism, it strikes me the real issue of terrorism is not dealt with well by war, but by other means. War is more likely, I think, to kind of expand terrorism as opposed to diminish it. Most of the tools we have for use against terrorism, it's cooperation, intelligence, sharing, it's special forces use. It's a number of things. Carrier groups and bomber groups and missiles tend not to be very useful in terms of dealing with non-state actors around the globe. So I think on all of these bases, then I'd say we should be very cautious before we go to war. So whatever the legal standard, we want to be fairly cautious. Because I think most of the wars that we've been fighting in recent years don't stand up very well along that analysis. That if one looks at the question of the interests at stake, the long-term consequences, the casualties along the way, one can argue that most of our recent wars have not been ones that were arguably in our interest. But if you want to go to war, then the question is, what is the legal standard? It strikes me there are two levels of legal standard. The first is domestic law and constitution. The second is international. Both of these matter, though the most important one for us, I think the starting point has to be domestically. That, when can the United States government go to war? I would argue that the most important issue is a question of congressional authorization. That we're talking about war, again, not just use of military force episodically, but rather use of military force in a sustained fashion for political ends. In that case, there's really very little good argument for not using a congressional declaration of war. One potential substitute, authorization of force, was used in the case of after the terrorist attack of 9/11. Even the Bush administration argued there were important differences between an authorization of force, which typically sets forth a number of conditions and limits what the force can be used for, and a state of war, which has a number of automatic implications, such as severance of diplomatic relations. If you're going to go to the stage of war, I think it really does require a congressional declaration. That what's very important here to recognize the Constitution, I would argue, is very clear. Congress shall have the power to declare war. That presidents today, of course, don't like to recur to that. President Clinton, when asked about going to Congress over Kosovo, said that he talked to the Constitution leaves the president for good and sufficient reasons the ultimate decision-making authority. Well, I'm not sure what that part of the Constitution is. Lots of presidents, of course, have followed his lead and actually preceded him on that. But what's striking, and I think if we're concerned about limited government, is to recognize that kind of a claim for power, that the president and the president alone can make decisions of war and peace, really is suggestive of a sort of system we probably would not like. Back during the Cold War days, Caspar Weinberger, who was Ronald Reagan